August 9th, 1945. Tinian Island, Pacific Ocean. The sun had not fully risen yet. The airfield was quiet except for the distant sound of engines warming up. Mechanics moved slowly through the darkness. Officers checked clipboards. Guards stood at attention. On the runway waited a silver B-29 bomber. Its name was Boxcar. Inside the aircraft was a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen before. 3 days earlier, another B-29 had dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The explosion had stunned the world. Entire neighborhoods vanished in seconds. Shockwaves flattened buildings. Fires burned across the city. But Japan had not surrendered. In Washington, President Harry S. Truman was waiting for news. He had authorized the use of the atomic bomb, believing it would end the war quickly. The first explosion was meant to shock Japan into surrender. It had not. So now another bomber sat on a runway thousands of miles away. Another bomb waited inside its belly, and the world was about to change again. To understand why Truman allowed the second bomb to be dropped, you have to understand the situation in the summer of 1945. Germany had already surrendered in May. The war in Europe was over, but the war in the Pacific was still raging, and it was brutal. American forces had spent years fighting their way across the Pacific island by island. Each battle was worse than the last. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, tiny specks of land that turned into killing fields. Japanese soldiers rarely surrendered. Many fought to the death. Others launched desperate attacks against American lines. Civilians sometimes threw themselves from cliffs rather than be captured. The numbers terrified American planners. The invasion of Japan itself was expected to be far worse. Military planners had already drafted the plan. Operation Downfall. It would be the largest amphibious invasion in history. Hundreds of thousands of American troops would land on the Japanese home islands. Millions of Japanese soldiers and civilians were preparing to resist. American estimates were grim. Hundreds of thousands of casualties, possibly more. Some advisors warned Truman that the invasion could cost 1 million lives before the war ended. The president understood the stakes. Every day the war continued meant more people dying, more soldiers, more civilians, more cities destroyed. So when the atomic bomb became available, Truman saw it as a way to force a quick surrender. The first bomb fell on Hiroshima on August 6th. The explosion stunned American leaders. Even the scientists who built the bomb were shocked by its power. But something strange happened in Tokyo. The Japanese government did not surrender. Instead, the leadership argued. Some leaders wanted peace. Others wanted to keep fighting. They hoped for better terms. They hoped the United States might negotiate. Time passed. Hours turned into days. In Washington, the delay worried Truman and his advisors. They feared Japan might still resist even after Hiroshima. There was also another factor, the Soviet Union. For months, the Soviets had promised to enter the war against Japan. Stalin had agreed to attack Japanese forces in Manchuria. On August 8th, the Soviets finally declared war. Millions of Soviet troops began pouring across the border. Their offensive moved with terrifying speed. Japanese armies that had fought for years suddenly collapsed. Now the United States faced a new concern. If the war dragged on, the Soviets might occupy parts of Japan, just like Germany. That possibility worried American leaders. The shape of the post-war world was already taking form. The United States wanted the war finished before Japan could be divided between competing powers. Meanwhile, on the island of Tinian, the crew of Boxcar prepared for their mission. The bomb they carried had a nickname, Fat Man. Unlike the Hiroshima bomb, this one used a different design. It relied on a complex implosion system that squeezed plutonium into a supercritical mass. The scientists believed it would be even more powerful. Before takeoff, the crew received their orders. Primary target, Kokura. Secondary target, Nagasaki. The mission was simple. Fly to Japan, drop the bomb, return to base. At 3:47 a.m., Boxcar lifted off the runway. The aircraft climbed slowly into the dark sky. No one on board spoke much. Each man knew what the weapon behind them could do. Hours later, the bomber approached the Japanese coast, but something had gone wrong. Clouds and smoke covered Kokura. The bombardier could not see the target. The crew circled, once, twice, 3 times. Fuel was running low. Anti-aircraft guns were beginning to fire. Finally, the pilot made a decision. They would head to the secondary target, Nagasaki. By the time Boxcar arrived over the city, the weather was still poor. Clouds covered most of the valley. For a moment, it seemed the mission might fail. Then the clouds opened, just long enough. The bombardier saw the target through a small break. He pressed the release button. The bomb fell away from the aircraft. 43 seconds later, the world exploded again. A blinding flash filled the sky. A fireball expanded across the valley. Buildings collapsed. Windows shattered miles away. A column of smoke rose thousands of feet into the air. Nagasaki had been struck by the second atomic bomb. Back in Washington, Truman received the report. The weapon had worked, but the decision would echo across history. 2 atomic bombs in 3 days. Cities destroyed. Thousands dead. Now the world waited to see what Japan would do next. Would the bombs end the war? Or would the fighting continue anyway? Because inside the Japanese government, the argument was still not over, and the final decision had not yet been made. Tokyo, Japan, August 9th, 1945. The city was quiet, but the quiet felt strange. Many buildings were already gone. Months of firebombing had turned entire districts into blackened fields of ash. Smoke still drifted through parts of the capital. Trains ran slowly. Food was scarce. Soldiers filled the streets. Inside the Imperial Palace, the leaders of Japan were gathering. They called themselves the Supreme War Council. 6 men. 6 men deciding the fate of an empire. They sat around a long table in a guarded room. Maps covered the walls. Telephones sat on small wooden desks. Messengers moved quietly through the corridors. The council had argued for months. Some believed the war was lost. Others believed Japan could still fight. They hoped for one last battle. A battle so costly that the United States might offer better terms. They believed the Americans feared casualties. They believed Japan could make the invasion unbearable, but the situation was collapsing faster than anyone expected. First came the news from Hiroshima, an entire city destroyed by a single bomb. At first, many officers refused to believe it. They thought it must be propaganda. They thought the Americans were exaggerating. Then came confirmation, a weapon unlike anything ever used in war. Still, the council argued, some generals insisted Japan could endure even this. Then, on the night of August 8th, another shock arrived. The Soviet Union had declared war. For months, Japan had hoped Moscow might act as a mediator between Tokyo and Washington. Japanese diplomats had quietly asked the Soviets to help negotiate peace. Now those hopes vanished. Soviet tanks were already moving. In Manchuria, one of the largest Japanese armies in the world, suddenly faced a massive invasion. The Red Army attacked with overwhelming force. Armored divisions smashed through Japanese defenses. Aircraft filled the sky. Entire units collapsed within hours. Years of preparation disappeared in a single night. And then, on the morning of August 9th, another report reached Tokyo. Another city destroyed. Nagasaki. Another atomic bomb. The room fell silent when the message was read. 2 cities, 3 days, 2 bombs that could destroy entire cities. The implications were terrifying. If the United States had more of these weapons, the destruction might continue indefinitely. One by one, Japanese cities could vanish. Still, the council was divided. The army leaders remained stubborn. They believed surrender would destroy the nation. They believed Japan could still fight a decisive battle on the home islands. Millions of civilians had already been mobilized. School children were being trained with bamboo spears. Farmers were told to prepare for combat. The generals believed that if the American invasion was bloody enough, Washington might negotiate. They wanted guarantees. They wanted to preserve the emperor. They wanted to avoid occupation. They wanted to keep their military institutions intact. But the reality outside the meeting room was brutal. Japan's navy was gone. Most of its air force had been destroyed. Cities were burning, supplies were running out. And now, the atomic bomb had changed the rules of war. Inside the meeting room, the arguments grew louder. One minister spoke of survival. Another spoke of honor. Some warned that continued resistance would mean national destruction. Others insisted surrender would be worse. Hours passed. No agreement. Outside, American aircraft still flew over Japan almost daily. Bombers crossed the sky. Air raid sirens echoed through the streets. Meanwhile, across the Pacific Ocean, President Truman was following every development closely. He had already approved the use of atomic weapons, but he still hoped the bombs would end the war quickly. The longer the war continued, the greater the danger. The invasion plans were already moving forward. American soldiers were training for the assault on Japan. Ships were gathering. Supplies were being stockpiled. The scale of the operation was enormous. Entire armies would land on Japanese beaches. The battles would be fierce. Every projection suggested terrible losses. Truman knew that every day without surrender meant the invasion was becoming more likely. But there was another concern: the Soviet Union. As Soviet troops pushed deeper into Manchuria, American leaders worried that the Red Army might advance even further. If the war lasted too long, Soviet forces might occupy parts of northern Japan. The post-war world was already beginning to take shape. Every decision mattered. Back in Tokyo, the Supreme War Council still could not reach agreement. 3 members supported accepting the Allied terms. 3 members refused. The vote was deadlocked. Japan stood on the edge of disaster, but its leaders could not decide what to do. Night began to fall over the capital. The city was dark. Electricity was limited. Many streets were lit only by lanterns. Inside the palace, the arguments continued. At last, someone suggested something that had almost never happened before. They would ask the emperor. For centuries, the emperor of Japan had remained above politics. He was considered divine. He rarely intervened directly in government decisions. But now, the nation faced destruction. The council decided the emperor must speak. Messengers moved quickly through the palace corridors. Officials prepared the room. The emperor would soon hear the arguments himself. Outside the palace walls, millions of Japanese citizens slept uneasily. They did not know that the future of their country was being decided at that very moment. Inside the palace, the ministers prepared their cases. Some would argue for surrender, others would argue to continue the war. The emperor would listen, and whatever he decided could end the conflict that had consumed the world for 6 years. But not everyone in Japan was ready to accept surrender. Even as the council prepared to meet the emperor, some officers in the Japanese military were already planning something dangerous. They believed surrender was betrayal. They believed the war must continue, and they were willing to take desperate action to stop anyone who tried to end it. Inside the imperial palace, the room was prepared. The ministers stood when the emperor entered. Emperor Hirohito was small, soft-spoken, and calm. He wore a simple military uniform. His face showed little emotion, but everyone in the room understood what this moment meant. The future of Japan rested on his decision. One by one, the leaders spoke. The generals argued first. Japan still had millions of soldiers, they said. The American invasion would be costly. If the United States lost enough men, they might accept better terms. Japan could still defend the homeland. Then the civilian leaders spoke. They described the destruction already spreading across the country. Cities burned, factories were gone, the navy was gone, food supplies were shrinking. Now the atomic bomb had introduced a weapon capable of destroying entire cities in a single moment. They warned that if the war continued, Japan itself might disappear. The emperor listened quietly. For hours he said nothing. The arguments repeated. Honor, survival, duty, fear. The room grew hot. Papers piled up on the tables. Ashtrays filled with cigarette butts. Still, the council was deadlocked. Finally, the prime minister turned toward the emperor. He asked the question no one had asked before. What does His Majesty wish? The room fell silent. For a long moment, the emperor looked down at the table. Then he spoke. His voice was quiet, but every man in the room leaned forward to hear. He said the war must end. Japan had suffered enough. The enemy had developed a terrible new weapon, capable of destroying the nation itself. If the fighting continued, it would not only lead to the collapse of the Japanese people, but the destruction of human civilization. Therefore, he said, Japan must accept the Allied terms. The War Council had its answer. The emperor had broken the deadlock. Japan would surrender. But the decision did not end the crisis immediately. That night, a group of young army officers launched a desperate plan. They believed surrender was betrayal. They believed the emperor had been misled. If they could stop the announcement, they might continue the war. The officers moved through Tokyo in darkness. They tried to seize control of the imperial palace. They searched for the recording of the emperor's surrender message. They hoped to destroy it. They hoped to prevent the broadcast. Inside the palace, loyal guards blocked their path. Confusion spread through the night. Officers argued. Some units refused to join the rebellion. Others hesitated, unsure whether the coup would succeed. The conspirators searched desperately for the recording, but could not find it. The message had already been hidden safely inside the palace. By morning, the coup collapsed. The officers who had tried to stop the surrender realized the war was over. Some took their own lives. Others surrendered. Japan's last attempt to continue the war had failed. On August 15, 1945, the Japanese people gathered around radios across the country. For many of them, it was the first time they had ever heard the emperor's voice. The broadcast was formal and difficult to understand. The emperor spoke in careful language, but the meaning was clear. Japan would accept the Allied terms. The war was over. Across the world, the news spread quickly. In the United States, crowds poured into the streets. Soldiers embraced. Church bells rang. Newspapers rushed out special editions. After nearly 6 years of global conflict, the Second World War had finally ended. In Washington, President Truman prepared to address the nation. The decision to use the atomic bomb had been one of the most difficult choices of his presidency. 2 bombs had destroyed 2 cities. Thousands had died, but the war had ended without the invasion that many believed would cost even more lives. Truman believed the weapon had forced a decision that otherwise might have taken months of bloody fighting. Others would debate that judgment for decades. Historians would argue about the bomb. Some would say it saved lives by ending the war quickly. Others would say Japan was already close to surrender. The debate continues even today. But in August of 1945, the immediate result was undeniable. The fighting stopped. Across Asia and the Pacific, soldiers lowered their weapons. Prison camps opened. Ships turned home. Cities began the long process of rebuilding. Weeks later, representatives of the Japanese government boarded an American battleship anchored in Tokyo Bay. The ship was the USS Missouri. On September 2, 1945, Japanese officials signed the official surrender documents. The ceremony lasted only a few minutes. Pens scratched across paper. Generals stepped forward. Photographers captured the moment. The most destructive war in human history ended with a few signatures. President Truman later reflected on the decision that had brought the conflict to its conclusion. He knew the atomic bomb had opened a new and terrifying chapter in human history. For the first time, humanity possessed the power to destroy entire cities instantly. The world would never be the same. But in that moment, his responsibility had been clear. End the war. Bring the soldiers home. Stop the killing. The second atomic bomb helped force that decision, and with it, the war that had consumed the world finally came to an end. The choice remains one of the most debated decisions in modern history. Some say it was necessary. Others believe another path might have existed, but the question remains the same. If you had been in Truman's position in August 1945, with a weapon capable of ending the war but with terrible consequences, what would you have done? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story of one of the most consequential decisions of the 20th century, make sure to like and subscribe. More historical stories are coming soon. Thanks for watching.